محمد الهادي البشير قد جاءنا حقا نذير.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. This is the second installment in the series of presentations on why Islam is true. In this presentation, I will show that God exists. Now, God exists is a claim. Remember that my approach in this series of short presentations is to evaluate the truth of such claims based on an examination of the evidence for them as well as the evidence against them. Let's start with the evidence that supports this claim. Before I try to find this evidence on my own, I'd like you to step back with me for a moment and recall that the reason why we are evaluating the truth of this claim, the claim that God exists, in other words, is because it is part of our evaluation of a larger claim that is the title of this series of presentations, namely the claim that Islam is true. Remember from the previous presentation that when I make the claim Islam is true, I have a clearly defined meaning of the term Islam in mind. What I mean by Islam is the claim that God created the universe, put us in it for a great purpose, and sent us messengers to tell us our purpose so that we might gain eternal happiness in our life after death. This claim rests on the subclaim that God created the universe. This subclaim, in turn, rests on a further subclaim that God exists. As I begin this presentation with the goal of showing you that God exists, I want you to bring to mind that this claim, God exists, is a subclaim of a larger claim. Namely, the claim that God created the universe, put us in it for a great purpose, and sent us messengers to tell us our purpose, so that we might gain eternal happiness in our life after death. Now, if God created the universe, put us in it for a great purpose, and sent us messengers to tell us our purpose, so that we might gain eternal happiness in our life after death, then surely He must have shown us that He exists. In other words, surely He must have given us some signs, arguments, indications of His existence so that the purpose for His creating us might be realized. In fact, He has. Therefore, I don't need myself to discover the evidence that supports the truth of the claim that God exists. All I need to do is evaluate the evidence that He Himself would be presenting us with if, in fact, it was the case that Islam is true. For that, I need to turn to the Quran. Here is an important verse to which we will be returning again and again throughout this series of presentations. In this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Verily, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, the succession of night and day, the ships that sail the sea with profit for mankind, the rain which God sends down from the sky and then gives life therewith to the earth after its death, the animals of all kinds that He scatters through the earth, the change of the winds and the clouds that they swirl between the sky and the earth. In all of these are surely great and numerous signs for those who reflect." This is the first of dozens of other verses in the Quran that point to the phenomena of the universe as evidence for God's existence. Here are 20 other sets of verses that I encourage you to look up on your own. If you follow the arguments of this series of presentations, you will see that these 20 sets of verses are all making the same argument that this verse that we are looking at now is making. And you will also see that there are many, many other verses in the Quran that do the same. The fact that the universe is evidence for the existence of God is one of the most important and central themes of the Quran. We will see in the fifth installment in this series of presentations that this Quranic argument is in fact simple and straightforward, and that it only seems obscure in the present age because of the irrational yet nevertheless powerful influence of materialism. For now, I will assume that the Quranic argument is not yet clear in your mind, and I will proceed to explain it until it does become clear. The question that you are probably asking as you read the statement on the screen, "The universe is evidence for the existence of God," is why? Why is the universe evidence for the existence of God? There's more than one reason why. In this presentation, I will focus on one of these reasons, which is that the universe is evidence for God's existence because it is contingent. The word contingent is not an everyday word like apple or orange, and therefore needs a definition. Here's a definition of what it means for a fact to be contingent. A fact is contingent when it could have been otherwise. Let's clarify this definition by applying it to the verse that we just saw. That verse mentions several facts in the universe. The first fact that the verse mentions is the creation of the universe, the fact that it did not exist and then began to exist. This fact shows us that the universe's existence is a contingent fact. The existence of the universe, the fact that the universe exists, is a contingent fact. Why is it a contingent fact? Well, remember that a contingent fact is a fact that could have been otherwise. And the universe's existence is a contingent fact because even though it exists, it could have been otherwise. It could have not existed. The fact that it could have not existed makes it contingent. This fact that it could have not existed can be known through reason, and it can also be known through scientific inference, as we will explain in a future presentation on the creation of the universe. The second fact that the verse mentions is the fact of the night, and the third fact is the fact of the day. The verse talks about the succession of the night and day. Now, the night and the day that we experience in the world, both of these facts are contingent facts. The night is contingent because even though it might be night right now, it could have been day. And the day is contingent because even though it is day right now, it could have been night. So the day and night are contingent facts. The verse then mentions the fact that ships sail in the sea. The sailing of ships in the sea is also a contingent fact because ships sail, but they could have sank, as we see in many cases when ships do in fact sink. The verse then talks about the fact of rain, that God sends down water from the heavens. He sends down rain from the sky. Rain too is a contingent fact because it might be raining right now, but it could have been sunny. So rain is a contingent fact. The verse then goes on to mention many other facts. It mentions the facts of plant life, animal life, winds and clouds, and other verses in the Quran that expound this argument that we are explaining in this presentation. They mention many other phenomena, many other facts in the universe. What all of these verses point to is that everything in the universe is contingent because everything in the universe could have been otherwise. The question that this raises is, what made the things in the universe the way that they are? When something is contingent, when a fact is contingent, then it's true because it's a fact. But the fact that the fact is contingent leads us to ask the question, what made it the way that it is? The contingency of a fact reveals that there was something external to that fact that made it the way that it is. So the universe's existence is a contingent fact. So it exists, the universe exists, this is a fact, but since this is a contingent fact, it could have not existed. This leads us to ask the question, what made it exist? The night is a contingent fact because it could have been day. That leads us to ask the question, what made it night? The day is a contingent fact because it could have been night. That leads us to ask the question, what made it day? The ships that sail in the sea, their sailing is a contingent fact. That leads us to ask the question, what makes them sail? The rain that falls from the sky is a contingent fact. That leads us to ask the question, what made it rain? Except for the first fact that we just saw, namely the fact that the universe began to exist, which we'll put aside for now, all the other four facts, they are all recognized as contingent by scientists, even though they don't say so. The fact that a scientist asks the question, what made it night, day, what made ships sail, what made it rain, reveals that he or she sees that there was something outside of these facts that made them the way that they are. The entire project of modern science is based on the perception of contingency in all of the facts of the universe. Now, the way that a scientist will answer questions such as these is by pointing to some other contingent fact in the universe. So when a scientist poses the question, what made it night or what made it day, he'll point to nuclear fusion in the core of the sun, which releases light and heat energy, and the rotation of the earth around its own axis, which turns various parts of it towards the sun, making it day over there, and then turns those parts away from the sun, making it night over there. When he's asked about what makes ships sail, he'll point towards the density of the material with which they are made, which causes them to float, or the fact that the ship has been carefully designed so that the weight of the water that the ship displaces is greater than the weight of the ship itself, creating an upwards force up from the sea, making the ship float, as well as the winds that blow that actually make the ships sail, makes them move. When he's asked what makes it rain, he'll point to the fact that the sun causes the water in the seas and the rivers to evaporate. This evaporation, water vapor goes up into the sky, condenses high up in the sky where it's cooler in the form of clouds, and then depending on where these clouds are moved and the temperatures and the movement of the winds, it may rain in a particular place or it may not rain. Science studies contingent facts and explains them with reference to other contingent facts. Scientists study contingent causation. The contingent causation that they study is true, but when it's studied without reference to God, it is inadequate and misleading because it implicitly says that every contingent fact in the universe was a contingent fact, ad infinitum. Let me explain. Let's take a contingent fact. Let's take the last contingent fact that we saw, namely the falling of the rain from the sky. We saw that the thing that a scientist might say makes the falling of the rain true is the water cycle, the fact that the heat of the sun evaporates the water in the rivers and seas, which rises and then forms clouds and then condenses and and the drops of rain get heavier and heavier until eventually they come down as rain. Now, this explanation, this cause, the thing that made the first contingent fact true, namely the rain, was another contingent fact. The evaporation, the rising of the water vapor and its condensing into clouds and falling down as rain is itself a contingent fact. All of these are contingent facts. And that leads us to ask the question, what made them true? Now, a scientist will quickly point to a third contingent fact. So he might say that the rising of the water vapor and the formation of clouds and the moving of clouds and the condensation ultimately into rain is caused by wind streams moving in different directions, which create different pressure areas. But this too is a contingent fact, because the movement of wind in a particular area is a contingent fact. This was another contingent fact that was, by the way, mentioned in the verse that we just saw. And so that leads us to ask the question, what made this third contingent fact true? The scientist will quickly point to another contingent fact. He might say that the wind streams are caused by the uneven heating of the sun. So because the sun heats the surface of the earth unevenly, it creates areas of high and low pressure that begins the process of the movement of the winds, and then the movement of the winds is furthered by other factors that leads to the wind streams and greater discrepancies in high and low pressure. But this too is a contingent fact, so we need to ask what made this fourth contingent fact true, and they might point to another contingent fact and say that the uneven heating of the earth is caused by the fact that it rotates on an axis, and the axis is tilted about 23.5 degrees, and because it spins on this tilted axis, the sun heats the various areas of the earth unevenly. But this too is a contingent fact. What is it that made the earth spin in the first place, let alone spin on an axis? And there might be another contingent fact and another contingent fact and another contingent fact. And when these contingent facts are studied without reference to God, as most science classes are, it gives the impression that a never-ending series of contingent facts makes the contingent facts that we see around us true, but that is not possible, because there's nothing in such a series that would make anything true. Let me explain why. Let's take the analogy of mathematical theorems. Let's say that I discover a new mathematical theorem that nobody has ever seen or heard of before. I present it to an audience of mathematicians, and they're going to ask me, what is it that makes your theorem true? Prove it. I quickly pull out another theorem, even more amazing than the first one, and I say that the proof of the first theorem is this second one. They, of course, ask me for proof for the second theorem, after which I proceed to pull out a third theorem. They ask me for proof. I pull out a fourth theorem. They ask me for proof. I pull out another one. And then I say, don't waste your time. I have an infinite series of theorems. Every time you ask me to prove one theorem, I'll pull out an even more amazing theorem than the one that you just saw. Nobody will accept this, because no theorem makes any other theorem true. In order for a theorem to be true, it needs to be proven true by resting on axioms. An axiom is a statement that does not need to be made true by anything else. From axioms, I infer theorems. From there, I can infer more theorems, and so on. Everything ultimately needs to return to axioms. In order for a proof to be adequate, it must rest on axioms. The same is the case with the example that we're considering in this presentation. If one contingent fact is made true by another one, then by another one, then by another one, then by another one, and so on ad infinitum, this is unacceptable, because just as no theorem is made true by another theorem, no contingent fact is made true by any other contingent fact. In order for any contingent fact to be made true, it needs to rest on some necessary fact. A necessary fact is like an axiom in the case of mathematical theorems. An axiom, we saw, was something that is true, that does not need to be proven true. A necessary fact is a fact that does not need to be made true by anything else. Just as a mathematical theorem is only true if it rests on axioms, the contingent facts of the universe, which are in fact true, can only be true if they rest on a necessary fact. So if we look at this chain of contingent causation from the first contingent fact to the second contingent fact to the third to the fourth and so on until it ends at a necessary fact which must be there, if someone asks the question, what made any one of these contingent facts true? The answer, in reality, is not any other contingent fact. The answer, in reality, is that every contingent fact was actually made true by the necessary fact. To say that one contingent fact was made true by another contingent fact does not answer the question, what made it true? It simply delays the answer by passing the buck, by giving another fact to which the same question can be asked. A contingent fact can only be made true by a necessary fact. This is the most important point in this lesson. A contingent fact can only be made true by a necessary fact. Now, since all of the phenomena that were mentioned in the verse that we saw were all contingent phenomena, since we saw that the verses of the Quran, they highlight the fact that the facts of the universe are all contingent, and since contingent facts can only be made true by a necessary fact, the facts of the universe, they're all contingent, therefore they were all made true by a necessary fact, and that necessary fact is God. So when the Quran talks about the creation of the heavens and the earth, the succession of night and day, the ships that sail in the sea, the rain that God sends down from the sky and gives life therewith to the earth after its death, the animals of all kinds that He scatters through the earth, the wind and the clouds, when He talks about all of these things and says that in them are signs for those who reflect, then one of the things, this is not the only thing as we'll see in future presentations, one of the things that these phenomena, they point us to is they point us to the existence of God by virtue of their contingency. Because they could have been otherwise, we know that they were made by someone who could not have been otherwise. The universe is evidence for the existence of God because it is contingent. And a contingent thing can only be the case if it was made true by a being that exists necessarily. A being that exists necessarily. This concept is not immediately obvious to someone who hears it for the first time. That's why we need to now ask the question, what is a being that exists necessarily? And we'll take up the answer to that question in the next installment in this series of presentations. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.
صل وسلم ربي وأنعم على المعلم نور العيون محمد الهادي البشير قد جاءنا حقا نذير.
الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. In the previous lesson, we saw that the facts of the universe are all contingent. Contingent means that they could have been otherwise. And the fact that they could have been otherwise implies that they need something else to make them true. The night needs something else to make it be night. The day needs something else to make it be day. rain needs something else to make it fall from the sky, and so on. Scientists recognize that everything in the universe is contingent, even when they don't explicitly say so. And that's why they seek to explain why the contingent facts of the universe are true. And they do that by pointing to other contingent facts. But the problem is that when you point to another contingent fact as an explanation of why the first contingent fact is true, you then need another contingent fact to explain that one, and then another one, and so on. Now, a scientist who keeps pursuing this line of inquiry and never talks about God gives the unstated impression that this explanation of contingent facts by other contingent facts can go on forever. But that is not possible because, as we saw, there is nothing in such a series that makes anything true. And saying that one contingent fact was made true by another contingent fact merely delays the question what made the first one true. It doesn't answer it, just as pointing to one mathematical theorem as proof for another one merely delays the question of what made the first theorem true. What we need to prove mathematical theorems are axioms, and what we need to make any contingent fact true is a necessary fact, or, in other words, a fact that does not need to be made true by anything else. The existence of contingent facts shows that there is something that exists necessarily, and that is God. Now, God is more than just a necessary being. He is, for example, omnipotent, meaning that he can do anything. He's omniscient, meaning that he knows everything. He is also alive, and he speaks to us through his messengers. Since God is more than just a necessary being, a number of contemporary philosophers object that proving the existence of a necessary being is not the same as proving the existence of God. To an extent, this objection is correct, and that's why in a future lesson and a number of other lessons, we will demonstrate through rational arguments that the necessary being whose existence we have just proven does indeed possess the qualities that God possesses. For now, however, we will assume that this necessary being will turn out to possess the qualities of God, and therefore we will just refer to the necessary being as God. But there's another reason as well why it makes sense to immediately call this necessary being God, and that is that the quality that distinguishes God from everything else is actually his necessary existence. Let me explain why. Now, let's take everything whose existence we can discern through our senses, namely the physical universe. The things in the physical universe have one or more of certain essential qualities. Things in the universe have a location. Things in the universe, if they are composed of matter, if we're talking about objects that have mass, then they have a size. Things in the physical universe, again, if they are objects that have mass, move. Things in the universe, physical universe, objects are composed of matter. Other parts of the physical universe may be composed of energy. The things in the physical universe change. They are one way, then they are another way, and there's a continuous change in everything in the universe. Things in the physical universe all exist in time. In order for there to be change, there needs to be time. Now, all of these qualities, these essential qualities of things in the physical universe, all of them are, they make the thing that possess them contingent. Something that is in a location could have been in another location. Something that has one size could have had another size. Something that is moving might have been still, or it might have moved faster than it happens to be moving. Something that is composed of matter might have been composed of a different kind of matter, a different kind of element. Something that changes one way could have changed another way. Something that happens to be the way that it is at one time could have been that way at another time. All of these essential qualities of things in the universe make the things in the physical universe, make them all contingent. Now, another way to say that something is contingent is to say that it is needy. And classical exegetes of the Quran, they explain verses that talk about the things of the universe being in need of God. They explain the things of the universe, their need of God. They explain this intrinsic need as contingency. They say that they are actually the same thing. So for something to be contingent is the same as for it to be needy. And that's the same as for it to be dependent. Contingency, neediness, dependence, all of these are talking about the same concept. Now, because the things of the universe are contingent, needy, dependent, they point towards the existence of something else that is not contingent but necessary. Just as another way of saying contingency is neediness, another way of saying necessity in the context in which we are using it now is self-sufficiency or independence. And again, verses in the Quran that talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that talk about God being self-sufficient and not needing anything else, the classical Quranic exegetes, they identify this lack of need, this self-sufficiency, they identify it with necessary existence. Now, in order for this being to be necessary, self-sufficient, and independent, it cannot have any of the qualities, any of the essential qualities of the things in the universe that make them contingent. And that necessary being is, in fact, God. That's what we mean by God. When we say that God is the being who created the physical universe, what we mean in the context of the Quran is that God is the one who is needed by everything else and who himself needs nothing. God is the one who is needed by everything else and who himself needs nothing. This is in fact what we mean by necessary being. And this aspect of God's existence, the fact that he needs nothing and everything needs him, this is necessity, and this is actually what it means for God to be God. People once came to the Prophet Muhammad, God bless him and give him peace, and asked him to describe to them the thing that he worshipped. According to some transmissions, the questioners were idol worshippers whose idols were made of precious metals or precious stones or wood or some other substance in the universe, some other contingent substance. And so they asked the Prophet Muhammad, God bless him and give him peace, to tell them what his God was made of. When they asked this question, one of the most famous chapters of the Quran was revealed. This chapter is called Suratul Ikhlas, which means the Surah of Purification. And it's called the Surah of Purification, Ikhlas, because it purifies our conception of God from all aspects of contingency and brings out his complete and utter necessity. This surah, this chapter in other words, explains what it means for God to be a necessary being. Let's walk through it. The surah begins by saying, say. This is a command to the Prophet Muhammad, God bless him and give him peace. Later on, when in a future lesson, when we examine prophecies about the Prophet Muhammad, God bless him and give him peace, in previous scriptures, we'll see that one of those prophecies mentions that there will come somebody in whose mouth God will put his words. And verses such as this, and there are many verses in the Quran where the Prophet is commanded to say, there is somebody else who is telling him to say something, they indicate that words are being put in his mouth. The surah goes on to say that the great matter, it talks about some great matter. A little bit of Arabic for those who understand some Arabic. The word here is the word huwa, which is normally a pronoun. It means he, but classical Quranic exegetes, they explain that what's meant by huwa over here is a great matter. This is a common way in which the pronoun is used in the Quran and also in ancient Arabic poetry. So the verse answers the question that was posed to the Prophet, God bless him and give him peace, by saying that it is a great matter. God's existence is a tremendous fact. The existence of a being who needs nothing and who is needed by every single atom in the universe, this is a really tremendous fact. It says that the great matter is that God is utterly one. A little bit an Arabic digression. The word for one that is normally used in the Arabic language is wahid. The word that is used here is an unexpected word. It's a word ahad. Now, ahad is different from wahid. Wahid is one in the sense of something being one, in the sense that there can be two of that thing, or three, or four, or more. So wahid is a count noun. 1, 2, 3, 4. The word ahad has no 2, 3, 4. There's no 2, 3, 4 that comes after this word. And for this reason, the Quranic exegetes, they explain that what it means for God to be ahad is for him to be utterly one. One in the sense that for there to be more than one of that being that is God, the necessary being, is rationally impossible. It simply cannot be the case. His oneness is both external and internal. They say that it means that he is indivisible. He is one in the sense that he cannot be broken up into multiple parts or pieces or persons, as a Trinitarian belief might lead some people to believe, and he is also unmultipliable, as a polytheistic belief might lead some people to believe. Indivisible, unmultipliable, multiplicity in any way is impossible for God. Now, the Muslim theologians, in explaining these verses, they mention some philosophical arguments for why it is rationally impossible for a necessary being to be more than one. We won't go into those arguments at this stage. We'll consider two other arguments later on. One, an argument for God's oneness from design, and another one from his omnipotence. We'll hold off on that and we will return to this topic later on. But I want you to appreciate at a high level for now that anyone who has historically believed in the existence of more than one God, either explicitly as with polytheists, or almost explicitly, a little bit implicitly, such as Christians who believe in a Trinitarian unity, inevitably end up ascribing some kind of contingent quality to God. Keep that in your mind, and that's actually because it's not possible to believe in a God who is both a necessary being and multiple. And human experience throughout history is one kind of proof. Other proofs we will return to later on. The verse continues to say that God is the one who is besought by all, meaning that everything in the universe, everything in the physical universe needs God. That is why he is besought by it. And it says that even though everything needs him, he himself needs no one. This is actually what it means for the universe to be contingent and for God to be necessary. This verse is simply restating what we just saw when we said that God is the one who is needed by everything else and who himself needs nothing. This is what the argument for the existence of God from the contingency of things in the universe shows. This is what it means for God to be a necessary being. This is what is meant by necessary being. The idea of a necessary being is encapsulated in this chapter among many, many other chapters and verses in the Quran, because the idea of necessary being is the first thing that comes to one's mind when one thinks about God in the context of the Quran. The surah continues and says that he did not beget, he did not have any children. Quranic exegetes, they explain that this is because whenever somebody has children, the children are the same kind of thing as the parent, but nothing participates in God's godhood. He is utterly one. It is impossible, rationally impossible, for there to be another kind of thing that is God. Nor was he begotten, the verse says, and that's because he doesn't need anything to bring him into existence. If something is begotten, it means it needs the father and the mother to bring it into existence. God needs nothing, and he never began to exist. Anything that begins to exist is contingent, because it then needs something to bring it into existence. things that begin to exist contingently. Something that exists necessarily cannot begin to exist. And there is absolutely no one like him. This is how this chapter ends. And there's nothing like him because everything else is contingent, whereas he is necessary. This chapter of the Quran, along with the explanation with which we began this presentation, answers the question that this presentation seeks to answer. The goal of this presentation is to answer the question, what exactly is a necessary being? Is it some abstract and philosophical concept? The answer is no. A necessary being is a being that is needed by everything in the physical universe, but which itself does not need anything in the physical universe. It's a being that is not part of the physical universe because otherwise it would be contingent. It does not resemble anything in the physical universe, otherwise it would also be contingent, and it is utterly one. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.
صل وسلم ربي وأنعم على المعلم نور العيون محمد الهادي البشير قد جاءنا حقا نذير.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. In the previous presentation, I began to explain why the claim that the universe began to exist is evidence for the existence of God. I explained that there are two kinds of evidence for the truth of this claim. The first is scientific evidence. The second is philosophical evidence. In the previous presentation, I explained the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. I first explained several paradoxes that arise from imagining that the universe does not have a beginning. And then I explained that scientists have resolved these paradoxes by abandoning the position that the universe does not have a beginning, based on evidence such as the redshift and the general theory of relativity, which indicate that the universe is expanding and therefore had a beginning, and which is confirmed by the observation of cosmic background microwave radiation, as well as by many other observations regarding the evolution, size, and the composition of the universe. That the universe has a finite age, or in other words, that it began to exist, is now accepted as scientific fact. In this presentation, I will focus on the second kind of evidence, the philosophical evidence. This evidence is now part of what contemporary philosophers call the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. The word Kalam, remember, is the Arabic name for traditional Islamic theology. Contemporary philosophers formulate the Kalam cosmological argument like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. This is the beginning of the argument. The completion of the argument reasons from the conclusion of this argument to the existence of God. This is in fact how the Muslim theologian Ghazali formulated the argument about 1,000 years ago, and this formulation is taken almost verbatim from him. An important difference, however, is the use of the word cause. When Ghazali formulated this argument just under 1,000 years ago, he didn't use the expression cause, but the expression something that made it exist. The Arabic word for this is muhdith. The two expressions are different. Ghazali's expression is more general. A cause is something that is inert, lifeless, necessary. A cause is not a free agent. It does not have any volition. Fire, for example, is a cause of burning. This means that it is not a volitional agent that chooses to burn or not to burn. It simply burns. God, however, is not a necessary cause. God is a volitional agent with free will. I will show in a future presentation that the Kalam cosmological argument, as well as the argument from contingency that I presented earlier, all show that the universe was not brought into existence by some inert and lifeless cause. Rather, it was created by a volitional agent who freely chose to bring the universe into existence. God, in other words. Ghazali's expression, something that made it exist, is therefore a more accurate expression than cause, because it does not rush to the conclusion that the thing that made the universe is an inert cause. Instead, it suspends judgment on whether that thing is an inert and lifeless cause or whether it is a volitional agent with free will, concluding simply that the universe has something that made it exist. We'll therefore work with Ghazali's form of the argument. Now, the key premise in this argument is the second one, that the universe began to exist. Theologians and philosophers in the Western tradition have traditionally believed that the fact that the universe began to exist could not be proven by any rational argument. This is why, although Thomas Aquinas argued for God's existence from the contingency of the universe, he never formulated an argument from the fact that the universe began to exist. Like other Christian philosophers, all influenced by ancient philosophers such as Aristotle, Aquinas believed that the fact that the universe began to exist could only be discovered by faith in Scripture, not by any rational argument. In the Muslim theological and philosophical traditions, however, the argument from creation was even more popular than the argument from contingency. It was most famously formulated just under 1,000 years ago by Ghazali, and it is his formulation that is inspiring this presentation. But Ghazali was not the first to formulate the argument. He was preceded by dozens of other theologians, the most prominent of whom were his teacher Abdul Malik al-Juwayni, the renowned theologian and debater Abu Bakr al-Baqillani, and the founder of traditional Islamic theology Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. It is not surprising at all that so many Muslim theologians presented this argument, because, just like the argument from contingency, it was first presented in the Quran itself. The verse that I have cited so frequently in my presentations, for example, cites at its very beginning that the creation of the heavens and the earth, the fact that they began to exist, in other words, is one of the great signs for the existence of God. And here are 20 other verses, a small sample of many, many others, that cite creation as evidence for God's existence and omnipotence. I'll leave you to look up these verses yourself. The arguments of the Muslim theologians and philosophers for the beginning of the universe were unknown to Western thinkers until the recent scientific discovery that the universe began to exist with the Big Bang. The discovery that the universe began to exist naturally led to discussions about the existence of God, and in 1979, Christian philosopher William Lane Craig published his book, The Kalam Cosmological Argument, drawing the Western world's attention to the rational arguments of the Muslim theologians for the beginning of the universe, and from there, for the existence of God. The argument has since been widely critiqued and defended by dozens of philosophers, scientists, and Christian theologians, earning a place for itself in the Western philosophical tradition as the Kalam cosmological argument. Kalam, remember, is the word for traditional Islamic theology. I will now explain this argument, beginning with this presentation and continuing on through the several presentations that come after this one. I present the argument as I think a Muslim theologian, such as Ghazali, might present it today. This presentation will differ in several ways from many Western presentations of the argument. These differences make the argument clearer, more to the point, and more complete than its modern versions. But before I begin, I want to emphasize that the fact that the universe began to exist is obvious and intuitive. Muslim theologians went to great lengths to refute the arguments of those who claimed that the universe had no beginning. If I simply present their arguments with all of their complexities without showing first that their claim doesn't even need an argument, you might mistakenly imagine that they were trying to prove something that is very difficult to prove. Ghazali himself noted this almost 1,000 years ago, prefacing one of his responses to an unreasonable opponent with the comment that, quote, "Going to great lengths to prove things that are clear obscures them instead of clarifying them." The reason why it is obvious that the universe began to exist is that everything that you or I experience in the universe has an age, which is another way of saying that it began to exist a finite period of time ago. Let's look, for example, at the Quranic verse that we have seen so many times in these presentations. It begins by mentioning the heavens and the earth, which, according to modern arguments, have a finite age. I showed the scientific reasoning for this in the previous presentation. It then mentions the night and day, every night that we have experienced begins to exist at sunset and lasts until dawn. Every day that we have experienced begins to exist at dawn and then lasts until sunrise. Then it mentions the ships that sail the sea. Every ship that we've experienced began to exist when it was constructed. Every sailing passage that every ship has ever made across the sea began to exist when the ship left its dock and set sail towards its destination. Every wave in the sea that has ever splashed against the hull of any ship that has ever sailed began to exist. Every profit that humans have ever made from their trading voyages began to exist when they sold their goods for higher prices than they bought them for. Every drop of rain that has ever fallen from the sky began to exist when water vapor from the seas condensed into droplets of water. Every plant that has ever sprouted forth from the earth began to exist. Every animal that has ever existed began to exist when it was born. Every wind that blows began to exist. Every cloud that we have ever seen in the sky began to exist. Everything that we experience in the universe began to exist. If everything that we experience in the universe has an age and began to exist a finite period of time ago, then the universe as a whole too must have an age and must have begun to exist. The claim that the universe began to exist is straightforward, intuitive, and a simple generalization of our everyday experience. The claim that the universe did not begin to exist, that it has existed for an infinitely long period of time, whatever that means, is strange, counterintuitive, and contrary to everything that we experience. We have never seen anything existed forever, nor, as I will show shortly, will we ever see such a thing. It is perfectly reasonable to conclude that the universe has an age and began to exist, and it is stubbornly unreasonable to conclude that the universe does not have an age and never began to exist. But there is a problem. The problem is that there is always some atheist philosopher who will object that it is perfectly possible for the universe to have existed forever. If I simply dismiss such philosophers' claims as strange, counterintuitive, and unreasonable, which in fact they are, you might imagine that I am avoiding their arguments. To dispel that imagination, I will now proceed to show you why their arguments are flawed and incoherent. Some of the arguments that I will present in this presentation and the next one might get a bit complex. I want you to keep in mind throughout, however, that the reason for the complexity of my responses is not that it is difficult to show that the universe began to exist. Rather, the reason for their complexity is that the atheists who object to the claim that the universe began to exist often conceal the flaws of their arguments with complex concepts in order to give the misleading impression that this is a claim that is too complex for the average thinking person to evaluate on his own. In this presentation, I want to remove this misleading impression and show you that you can, in fact, evaluate the claim on your own and easily come to your own independent conclusion that this claim is absurd and false. The first step is for you to see that the claim, the universe did not begin to exist, the atheist claim, is logically equivalent to two other claims. It is logically equivalent to the claim that the universe has existed for an infinite quantity of time. The reason why it is logically equivalent to this claim is that to claim that the universe did not begin to exist is to claim that if you go back in time from the present moment, there is no point in time that was not preceded by another point in time. And the quantity of time that has passed before the present moment is infinite. Or, to put it more clearly, it is endless. It has no end. And that is the same thing as saying that the universe has existed for an infinite quantity of time. This second claim, in turn, is logically equivalent to a third claim, namely the claim that an infinite quantity of time has elapsed. The reason why the second claim is equivalent to this third claim is because to claim that the universe has existed for an infinite quantity of time is to claim that there is no beginning to the quantity of time in the backward direction, but that it has nevertheless reached the present moment. That is to say that an infinite or endless quantity of time has elapsed. That's the third claim. Now, since all of these claims are logically equivalent, If any one of them is false, then the other two must also be false. I will now take each one of these claims in turn and show you why they are false. Beginning from the bottom with the last claim. You can see the falsehood and absurdity of this claim by reflecting on what exactly it means. The word infinite in the phrase an infinite quantity of time means endless. And the present perfect tense verb has elapsed means has come to an end. The statement an infinite quantity of time has elapsed therefore means an endless quantity of time has come to an end. This is a plain contradiction in terms because it is not possible for something that does not end to come to an end. The claim is self-contradictory. Since this claim is logically equivalent to the other two claims, its absurdity and falsehood entails the absurdity and falsehood of the other two claims as well. However, I will now proceed to consider each of the other two claims independently and show you why they are absurd and false on their own. I will begin with the second claim, that the universe has existed for an infinite quantity of time. This claim is absurd because an infinite quantity of anything is absurd. Grasping the absurdity of an infinite quantity of anything does not require any philosophical training. It can be grasped by a 5-year-old child. Consider the following scenario. Umar and Mary, two 5-year-olds, are arguing over who broke Auntie Zubaida's window. Auntie Zubaida is their neighbor. Mary shouts, "You broke it." Umar refuses, "Did not." Mary insists, "Did too." Umar responds, "Did not." Did too, did not, did too, did not, did too, did not. Now, Mary has heard from someone that infinity is the biggest number of all. Seeing that the sequence of accusations and denials between her and Umar will continue unresolved, 5-year-old Mary makes her move to silence Umar by screaming at the top of her voice, "Did to infinity." Umar, also aware that infinity is the biggest number of all, immediately demonstrates the absurdity of the concept of the biggest number of all by responding, "Did not infinity plus 1. 5-year-old Umar has just shown that an infinite quantity of anything is an absurd concept. Let me clarify Umar's argument. Umar has observed that if infinity is a quantity, how much something is in other words, then you can add 1 to it. Mary is using infinity as a quantity. She is saying did to an infinite number of times. Since she is using infinity as a quantity, Umar can add 1 to it. But this immediately invalidates the very concept of infinity. Remember that infinity in this context means endless, and quantity means the amount or how much something is. If an infinite or an endless amount of something is a quantity, then you can add 1 to it. But if you can add 1 to it, then it is no longer endless, because in order to add 1 to anything, in order to increase it by 1, in other words, it needs to have an end relative to which that increase can take place. If it has no end, it cannot be increased, because any increase always takes place relative to some end. If something can be increased, then it must have had an end before the increase and an other end after the increase. Umar's straightforward and intuitive observation demonstrates that you cannot have an infinite quantity of anything, because if something is a quantity, then it can be increased. And if it can be increased, then it has an end. And if it has an end, then it is not infinite. No quantity of anything can be infinite. And therefore, to return to our point of departure, it is not possible for the universe to have existed for an infinite quantity of time. Both the second and the third claims are absurd and false. I will now show you why the first claim is false. Consider any physical quantity. Let's take, for example, the number of orbits of any 2 planets around the Sun. Let's take Earth, which takes 1 Earth year to go around the Sun, and Mercury, which takes about 1/4 of an Earth year to go around the Sun. After 1 Earth year, Earth will have completed 1 orbit around the Sun, and Mercury will have completed 4. After 2 years, Earth will have completed 2 orbits around the Sun, and Mercury 8. After 3 years, Earth will be at 3, Mercury at 12, and so on. at any given time, the number of orbits of Mercury will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. After 1 year, it will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. After 2 years, it will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. After 3 years, it will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth, and so on. After any number of years, say n, it will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth, or in other words, 4n. Now, if this first claim is true, if it is true that the universe has no beginning, then the number of orbits of Mercury is infinite. Remember that infinite means endless. And the number of orbits of Earth is also infinite. Remember again that infinite means endless. But we know that the number of orbits of Mercury is always greater than the number of orbits of Earth by a factor of 4. And the only way for the orbits of Mercury to be greater than the number of orbits of Earth by a factor of 4 is for the number of orbits of Earth to have a beginning and an end, and for the number of orbits of Mercury to have a beginning and an end, and for the number of orbits of Mercury to be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. If the number of orbits of both are endless, infinite, then it is not possible to say that any one of them is greater than the other one. If the first claim here is therefore false. It is false because it entails that any two physical quantities that are increasing at different rates are the same after the passage of an infinite period of time. Even though at any given point in time, remember, if you take at any given point in time, you compare the number of orbits of Earth with the number of orbits of Mercury, at any given point in time, the quantity that is increasing faster is always greater than the quantity that is increasing more slowly. Let's recap what I have shown in this presentation. I began by saying that even though there is clear scientific evidence that the universe began to exist, the fact that the universe began to exist can also be demonstrated philosophically without recourse to the discoveries of modern science. I showed first that the claim that the universe began to exist is straightforward, intuitive, and a simple generalization of our everyday experience, and that the opposite claim, that the universe did not begin to exist, is strange, counterintuitive, and contrary to our everyday experience. I then formally demonstrated the absurdity of this opposite claim by showing that it is plainly absurd for an infinite, i.e. an endless quantity of time to elapse, i.e. end, because it is self-contradictory. Then by showing that any quantity can always be increased, which necessarily entails that it has an end and that it is not infinite. And finally, by showing that the fact that the universe did not begin to exist entails that two physical quantities that are increasing at different rates are equal, even though at every point in time they are actually different. Remember, at every point in time, the number of orbits of Mercury is 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. There are in fact many more arguments that illustrate the contradictions that are entailed by the claim that the universe did not begin to exist, both in the Muslim theological tradition and now, thanks to the work of philosophers such as William Lane Craig, also in the Western tradition. The idea, however, is very simple, straightforward, and intuitive to grasp. Anything that exists in the universe must be finite. To say otherwise is incoherent, self-contradictory, and entails a host of contradictions. There remains, however, one problem that I have not yet addressed, and that is the problem of the mathematical concept of infinity. I will, God willing, show in the next presentation that this mathematical concept is an imaginary concept that has no bearing on any of the arguments that I have presented here. In the process, I will also, God willing, show you additional philosophical arguments for the fact that the universe undoubtedly began to exist. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
صل وسلم ربي وأنعم على المعلم نور العيون محمد الهادي البشير قد جاءنا حقا نذير.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. In the second episode of this series of presentations on why Islam is true, I gave evidence for the claim that God exists. In the next three presentations, I reiterated this evidence and examined the evidence that is advanced by those who disagree with the claim. And I showed that the claim that God does exist is based on evidence, but the objections against it are not based on any evidence at all, and that they are in fact all fallacious and flawed arguments. I'd like you to recall from the second presentation that the evidence for God's existence in my presentations is taken from the Quran. I pointed you to about 20 verses that you could reference for yourselves and focused on the first verse in the Quran to cite this argument as evidence for God's existence. And that is the 164th verse of the second chapter. This verse points to a variety of phenomena in the universe as evidence or signs for God's existence. It points to the creation of the heavens and the earth, to the succession of the night and day, to the ships that sail the sea, to the rain that falls from the sky, to the plants that grow out of the earth following that rain, to the multitude of animals, to the change of the winds and the clouds, all of these things as great and numerous signs for the existence of God. What verses like this verse are saying is that the universe is evidence for God's existence. In the second presentation, I posed the question, why is the universe evidence for God's existence? And I then gave you the first reason why the universe is evidence for God's existence. That reason is that the universe is contingent. In this presentation, I will give you a second reason why verses such as this one cite the universe as evidence for God's existence. That second reason is that the universe began to exist. This second reason is actually mentioned right at the beginning of this verse, when it says that the creation of the heavens and the earth is one of the great signs for the existence of God. In the second presentation, I focused on the contingency of the universe as evidence for God's existence, and I promised that I would return at a later time to explain that the creation of the universe is another piece of evidence for God's existence. That time has now come. The focus of this presentation is the fact that the universe began to exist. Let's step back for a moment to recap why the universe, or to be more precise, the existence of the universe, is evidence for God's existence. The first reason is that the existence of the universe is contingent. If we take the universe as a whole, then we would say that the fact that the existence of the universe is contingent means that it exists, but that it could have not existed. That being the case, there must be something other than the universe that made it exist, and that leads us to ask the following question: what is that thing that made it exist rather than not exist? Using the line of reasoning that I have explained in detail in the last four presentations, we can quickly conclude that the thing that made it exist must be a necessary being, and that necessary being is what we are referring to as God. This argument for God's existence is called the argument for God's existence from contingency. As a side note, when I call this argument the argument from contingency, I am translating the Arabic terminology of the Muslim theologians who formalized this argument over 1,000 years ago and called it in Arabic Dalilul Imkan. I am not referring to the argument from contingency in the Western philosophical tradition, which has the same name, but which is different in a number of important ways from the argument in the Muslim theological tradition. I will, God willing, explain these differences in a later presentation. The second reason why the universe is evidence for God's existence is that it began to exist. If the universe began to exist, or in other words, if it did not exist and then began to exist, this also leads us to ask the question, then what made it exist? But
this question is slightly different than the question that I just asked a little while ago. Before, when I asked the question, then what made it exist? I was asking it because the contingency of the universe's existence demands that if it exists, something must have made it exist. Here, when I ask the same question, I'm asking it because the creation of the universe demands that something must have made it exist. I will explain this difference in greater detail again, God willing, in a future presentation. For now, just make mental note that the two questions are in fact different and that the two arguments are also quite different. This second argument is called the argument for God's existence from creation, which is a rough translation of its Arabic name in the terminology of the Muslim theologians, Dalilul Huduth. I will also explain in a later presentation that the contingency of the universe's existence entails that it began to exist, and that the fact that it began to exist entails its contingency. The two arguments are closely interrelated. But although they are interrelated, the second argument that I am about to explain in this presentation is more compelling than the one that I have explained in previous presentations. And even the most skeptical and critical of skeptics, if he is honest with himself, will see with the utmost ease from this argument that God absolutely must exist. Why is that so? I'll explain that shortly. But first, I want to show you that the universe did, in fact, without any doubt, begin to exist. As I explained in my first presentation, my approach throughout this series of presentations will be to take statements related to the truth of Islam as claims, and then examine the evidence for those claims as well as the evidence against them. Here, the claim that I am examining is the title of this presentation. The universe began to exist. What is the evidence that this claim is true? There are two kinds of evidence for the truth of this claim. The first kind of evidence is scientific evidence. The second kind of evidence is what I will call, for lack of a better term, philosophical evidence. I will return to this second kind of evidence in the next presentation, where I will explain what contemporary philosophers call the kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. The word kalam, by the way, is the Arabic word for traditional Islamic theology. In this presentation, however, I will focus on the first kind of evidence for the fact that the universe began to exist, the scientific evidence.
The scientific evidence for the fact that the universe began to exist is new evidence that has only been discovered during the last couple of decades. The evidence is overwhelming, and scientists consider it one of the revolutionary discoveries of modern science. The essence of that evidence can be grasped by anyone with a good high school education in science at a high level. I'm now going to explain that evidence at such a high level. The explanation will take some time, and you may need to take notes, listen to it more than once, and maybe even go back to review some of your previous science education. If you feel that it gets too long, and you think that you're perfectly happy to accept the beginning of the universe as scientific fact, then you can skip ahead to the last 5 minutes of this presentation, where I summarize the position of modern scientists and then explain why the beginning of the universe is such compelling evidence for the existence of God. Before the discovery of scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe, most scientists believed that the universe was infinite and fixed in size, or in other words, static. This belief was not grounded in any particular evidence, except perhaps in the fact that most of the stars that are visible to the naked eye appear to be fixed and regular in their movements across the night sky, which gives the impression of permanence and being static. They held on to this belief even though it led to several paradoxes. One of these paradoxes is called Olbers' paradox, named after the German astronomer Heinrich Wilhelm Olbers, who made it popular in 1823, arguing that if the universe had always existed, and if it was infinite in size, with an infinite number of stars scattered throughout its expanse, then, as we looked up at the night sky, in any direction, our line of sight should always intercept some star, whether those stars are close or whether they are far. And the night sky should not be dark as we observe it, But the close and distant stars should appear to line up as appears on the slide, and the night sky should not be dark as we observe it, but as bright as day. A couple of decades later, in 1862, several scientists popularized another paradox that was the opposite of Olber's paradox, called the heat-death paradox. According to this paradox, the night sky should not be bright as day, but pitch dark without any stars at all. This paradox is based on the second law of thermodynamics. A very approximate statement of this law is that heat naturally dissipates, and that the temperature of things in the universe naturally or spontaneously cools down. If that's the case, then if the universe has existed for an infinite amount of time, then there has been enough time for all of the stars that we see in the sky to have burned out. And the universe should have reached its heat death, or in more scientific terms, its ultimate thermal equilibrium. The very fact that we look up at the night sky and see any stars at all is evidence that the universe has not existed forever. Another paradox with an infinite and static universe was formulated earlier at the end of the 17th century by Isaac Newton, who revolutionized our understanding of planetary motion with his law of universal gravitation. But although his law explained the puzzling and seemingly unpredictable movement of planets across the night sky, it led him to ask a simple question. If the universe has existed forever, then there has been enough time for all of the planets and stars in the universe to mutually attract each other by their forces of gravity and collapse into a single massive object. Why is it then that when we look up at the night sky, we see a multitude of objects that are still so far apart from each other? There's also another paradox with gravity. If the universe is infinite in size, with an infinite number of stars and planets scattered evenly throughout space, then every object should be pulled in every direction by the gravitational forces of the infinite number of objects everywhere in the universe, and these forces of gravity should then cancel each other out. This paradox is the opposite of the previous one. According to this paradox, gravity should not be a force that has any effect at all. The fact that gravity does result in the motion of the planets around the sun, as Newton explained, should therefore suggest that it is not infinite in size, or that it has not existed forever. Together, Olber's paradox, the heat-death paradox, the paradox of gravitational collapse, and the paradox of gravitational cancellation should all suggest that the universe should be finite in size and that it should have a finite age. In 1929, American astronomer Edwin Hubble found evidence that proved all of these things, and for the first time in human history, proved something else. Not only was the universe not infinite in size, not only was it not infinite in age, it was also not static. The universe was not eternally fixed in size, as virtually everyone, even religious believers such as Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the pre-scientific age had believed. The fact that even religious believers have historically believed in a static universe is significant because we will see very shortly that a non-static universe is compelling evidence for the existence of God. And the fact that it has been accepted as true even by atheists indicates that the scientific evidence for it is extremely strong. The universe was expanding according to Hubble. Hubble's discovery was based on an analysis of the spectra of light that were emitted from the galaxies in the night sky. Let's review some high school physics. We have known since Newton that when we shine white light through a prism, it disperses the light into the various colors that compose it, and we see a rainbow. We know through laboratory experiments done on Earth that if we shine the same light through a clear container containing some element such as hydrogen or helium and so on, then gaps appear in the rainbow. These gaps are called spectral lines or absorption lines, and they are distinctive for every element. The absorption lines of hydrogen are different from the absorption lines of helium, which are different from the spectral or absorption lines of every other element. Since we know the spectral or absorption lines of every element, we can disperse the light that we detect from the galaxies in the night sky and figure out the elements that they are made of. Hubble did this and discovered that the distinctive spectral lines of the elements that made up the galaxies are all shifted towards the red end of the light spectrum. This is what scientists call redshift. The reason for this redshift, Hubble proposed, is that the galaxies are all moving away from us. Whenever a wave is emitted from an object that is moving away from us, its wavelength increases. With sound waves, this means that the pitch of the sound will seem lower. With light waves, this means that the color of the light will change and move towards the red end of the spectrum, the right-hand side on the slide that you see here. The wavelength of light decreases across its spectrum as the color changes gradually from blue on the left to red on the right. Hubble went on to measure the redshifts of 46 galaxies and then compared their distance from us to the magnitude of their redshift. He found that the further away the galaxy, the greater the redshift. In other words, the further away the galaxy, the faster it is moving away from us. It looked like everything was exploding away from everything else in space. It looked like the entire universe was expanding. Hubble had observed the expansion of the universe. The expansion of the universe was a revolutionary discovery for scientists. It has resolved paradoxes such as the ones that I just explained, and it has given coherence to many other scientific observations, laws, and theories. But the most revolutionary aspect of the fact that the universe is expanding is that it proves conclusively that the universe began to exist. Let me explain why. If the universe is static, if it has a fixed size, then if you turn back the clock of time, if you go back further and further into the past, the universe will retain its same fixed size at every time in the past. Although this is not evidence that the universe has existed forever, it may appear to someone who does not think carefully about the matter that the universe probably existed forever. I'll explain in the next presentation why, if you think carefully about the matter, you will easily see that it must have had a beginning. But let's put that aside for now. If, on the other hand, the universe is expanding, then if you turn back the clock of time, if you go back further and further into the past, 1 billion light years, 3 billion light years, 7 billion light years, 11 billion light years, 13 billion light years, the universe will get smaller and smaller. The reason why this is so significant is that the universe cannot continue to get smaller and smaller without end. At some point in the finite past, it needs to vanish into nothing. If you know the expansion rate of the universe, then you can calculate the time when it vanishes into nothing. This is the time when the universe began to exist. According to current scientific estimates, that time was just under 14 billion light years ago. As an aside, we can make a similar inference from the second law of thermodynamics, except that instead of turning the clock of time backwards, you turn it forwards. The second law of thermodynamics entails that heat is dissipating with the passage of time, as I explained a little while ago, and that there is a maximum limit to that dissipation, as I also explained. The state at which that maximum limit is reached is called thermal equilibrium. If the universe has existed forever, then enough time has passed for that thermal equilibrium to be reached. And as we look up at the night sky, we shouldn't see any stars at all. In fact, we shouldn't even exist to be able to look up at the night sky, because the biological functioning of our bodies cannot take place in a state of thermal equilibrium. The universe, therefore, must have had a beginning. The general principle is that any irreversible increase in the universe, such as its expansion, entails that the clock of time cannot be moved backwards indefinitely, because given enough time in the backward direction, the irreversible increase must have had a beginning. Any irreversible decrease in the universe, on the other hand, such as the dissipation of heat, entails that the clock of time cannot have moved forwards indefinitely, because given enough time in the forward direction, the irreversible decrease must have an end. Each of these therefore entails that the universe cannot have existed forever. It must have had a beginning. Any irreversible natural increase or decrease entails that the universe cannot have existed forever. The expansion of the universe, however, is particularly compelling evidence for the beginning of the universe because it directly entails that the actual stuff from which the universe is composed, matter, energy, space, and time, all began sometime in the past, just under 14 billion light years ago. Although credit for the discovery of the universe's expansion belongs to Edwin Hubble, it should have been discovered about 15 years earlier by Albert Einstein when he first formulated his general theory of relativity. The most straightforward solution to the equations that describe his theory is that the universe is expanding. The prevailing view among scientists at that time, however, was that the universe was static, and in order to make his new theory conform to this prevailing view, in order to prevent his equations from showing that the universe was expanding, he introduced a cosmological constant. When Hubble showed later that the universe was in fact expanding, scientists abandoned this cosmological constant and accepted the straightforward solution of the equations that demonstrated the expansion of the universe. Because he didn't accept the revolutionary discovery that was predicted by his own equations, Einstein later described the introduction of the cosmological constant as his biggest blunder. In recent times, the cosmological constant is making a comeback, but in a different context, not to show that the universe is static, but to show that it is expanding faster and faster with time. This is an extremely revolutionary discovery, and I will return to it in a later presentation. For now, what I want to show is that the general theory of relativity is additional evidence for the expansion of the universe, which in turn is conclusive evidence for the fact that the universe began to exist. Now, if the universe is expanding, then as we turn the clock of time backwards, it gets smaller. If you remember your gas laws from high school chemistry, then you will remember that squeezing particles into a smaller volume causes their temperature to increase. When the universe was smaller, the same amount of matter and energy were squeezed into a smaller volume, and they therefore had a higher temperature. The farther back you go in time, the smaller the universe, and consequently, the higher the temperature. At the event at which the universe began to exist, which scientists call the Big Bang, all the matter and energy in the universe were squeezed into a tiny point, and the temperature of the universe was therefore extremely, extremely high. Then, as the universe expanded, this cosmic temperature fell lower and lower to its current level. This background temperature of the universe comes from a background energy in the universe that is a remnant of the Big Bang, when the universe began to exist. This is why, in the 1940s, scientist George Gamow and his students argued that if the Big Bang had in fact happened, then the energy from the Big Bang should now pervade the entire universe. The reason why this energy should pervade the entire universe is that according to the general theory of relativity, the universe does not just expand at its edges, but everywhere throughout itself. The universe is expanding by the expansion of space-time at every point in the universe, because of which every point in space is moving further and further away from every other point in space, somewhat like the expansion of the surface of a balloon as you blow it up. Gamow and his students predicted that the energy from the Big Bang should be detectable today as an all-pervasive blanket of microwaves that is not appearing to come from any particular source, no particular star, no particular galaxy anywhere in the universe. In 1965, two young employees of Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey accidentally discovered this all-pervasive background microwave radiation. Scientists call this radiation the cosmic background microwave radiation, and it is widely considered as strong confirming evidence for the Big Bang. Scientists are now charting this background microwave radiation throughout the universe to get a better understanding of how the universe expanded into its present form. In addition to all of these discoveries, scientists have made discovery after discovery related to the composition, expansion, and evolution of the universe that repeatedly confirm that the universe originated at the Big Bang and has expanded ever since. It is now considered scientific fact that the universe is not infinite and not static, but that the universe is finite, that it is expanding, and that it began to exist. The most significant of these 3 points for us in this presentation is that the universe began to exist. At the beginning of this presentation, I explained that the existence of the universe is evidence for God's existence in 2 ways. The first is that it is contingent. The argument for God's existence from the contingency of the universe is called the argument from contingency. The second reason why the existence of the universe is evidence for God's existence is that the universe began to exist. And that's what I have been explaining in this presentation. The argument for God's existence from the fact that the universe began to exist is called the argument from creation. I said at the beginning of this presentation that this second argument, the argument for God's existence from the fact that the universe began to exist, is more compelling than the argument from contingency. And I promised that I would tell you at the end of this presentation why that is the case. The reason why the argument for the existence of God from the beginning of the universe is more compelling is that it puts divine action in the foreground. To understand what this means, I need you to recall what we learned in the previous presentation. In the previous presentation, I explained that belief in God coexists with science. It does not conflict with science and scientific explanations. And I illustrated that with the verse from the Quran that we have seen again and again from the second presentation in this series. In this verse, God describes the rain, the sending down of rain from the heavens as divine action. And he also describes the sprouting forth of vegetation from the ground after the rain falls as divine action. Both are divine action, yet the rain has a role to play in bringing forth vegetation from the ground. Divine action coexists with scientific explanation. The verse also says that God is the one who changes the winds, and it's understood from the verse that God is the one who moves the clouds. Yet the verse also says that the changing of the winds has a role in swirling the clouds. I then explained the coexistence of divine action and scientific explanations with respect to the water cycle. And I showed that since God governs the universe in a scientifically coherent way, belief in God coexists with science and scientific explanations. What we need to do is we need to see any natural phenomenon from 2 perspectives. There is a foreground view and there is a background view. In the foreground view, the natural phenomenon is explained with reference to another natural phenomenon with respect to natural processes. This is the scientific explanation. In the background, since both the prior and the subsequent natural phenomena are contingent phenomena, each one is being brought about through divine action. Their contingency reveals the fact that they were made to be by a necessary being. But if the universe began to exist, then the beginning of the universe cannot be explained by reference to any other natural phenomenon, because there was nothing There was no natural phenomenon before the beginning of the universe. The beginning of the universe was the beginning of natural phenomena. The beginning of the universe, therefore, puts divine action in the spotlight. There is only divine action. There is no scientific explanation. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.
صل وسلم ربي وأنعم على المعلم نور العيون محمد الهادي البشير قد جاءنا حقا نذير.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. In previous episodes of this series on why Islam is true, I have given evidence for the fact that the universe began to exist. In this episode, I will show why that is evidence for the existence of God. If the universe began to exist, it is evidence for the existence of a being that did not begin to exist. Reasoning from the beginning of the universe to the existence of a being that did not begin to exist, God in other words, is very similar to the argument for God's existence that I explained in the second episode of this series, in which I reasoned from the fact that the universe is contingent to the existence of a being that is not contingent, or, in other words, a necessary being. I showed that any contingent fact in the universe, the night, the day, the direction of the wind, the qualities of the seas, the stars, the planets, everything needs something else to make it true. Pointing to another contingent fact does not answer the question of what made it true, because that fact needs something else, and if it was made true by another contingent fact, then the series continues. To say that the series never ends is fallacious reasoning, because a collection of purely contingent facts is in even greater need of explanation than a single contingent fact. No contingent fact in the series really makes any other fact true, because it needs something else to make itself true. The series must end at a necessary fact that is not contingent, that does not need anything to make it true. The contingency of the universe is therefore evidence for the existence of a being that is not contingent, a necessary being, in other words. In the same way, the fact that the universe began to exist is evidence for the existence of a being that did not begin to exist. If the universe began to exist, something must have made it exist. If that being also began to exist, then the existence of that being would have to be caused by another being, and so on. To say that the series of beings that began to exist never ends is fallacious reasoning. It's fallacious reasoning because multiplying the number of things that began to exist multiplies the need for something to make them exist. Nothing that begins to exist really makes anything else exist, because it itself needs something else to make it exist. The series must end at a being that did not begin to exist. The fact that the universe began to exist is therefore evidence for the existence of a being that did not begin to exist, and that being is God. These two arguments are two detailed versions of the same general argument. The universe is dependent and needy. Therefore, there exists a being that fulfilled the dependence and neediness of the universe. In order for that being to truly fulfill the dependence and neediness of the universe, it needs to be independent and without need. The universe is dependent and needy because it is contingent, because it needs something else to make it the way that it is. The contingency of the universe is therefore evidence that it was made the way that it is by a being that is not contingent, necessary, in other words. the universe is also dependent and needy because it began to exist and needs something to make it exist. This is evidence for the existence of a being that did not begin to exist. If you think carefully about the meaning of necessity and beginninglessness, you will see that the fact that a being exists necessarily entails that it did not begin to exist. What it means for it to exist necessarily is that it doesn't need anything to make it exist. This means that it could not have begun to exist, because anything that begins to exist does need something to make it exist. Conversely, the fact that something did not begin to exist entails that it exists necessarily, because if it did not begin to exist, it doesn't need anything to make it exist, which is what we mean when we say that a being exists necessarily. The verses in the Quran that call us to reflect on the universe and its phenomena are all arguing that the universe is evidence for the existence of God. After these first 9 episodes of Why Islam is True, we now understand that there are 2 reasons why this is the case. The first is that the universe is contingent. The second is that it began to exist. Through its contingency, the universe is evidence for the existence of a necessary being. Through the fact that it began to exist, it is evidence for the existence of a being that did not begin to exist. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وهو حسبنا ونعم الوكيل.
صل وسلم ربي وأنعم